At some point in human history, every civilization asked the same questions. Not in the same language, not in the same temple, but the same questions. Where do we come from? What's the meaning of life? And where will we go after death? Religion tried to answer those questions. For thousands of years, with extraordinary power and reach, it gave empires their moral architecture and ordinary people a reason to keep going. And now, in the span of a single generation, hundreds of millions of people are walking away from it. But here's what's interesting. They're not walking away from the questions. They're walking away from the answer they were given and going looking for one of their own. So what happens when people leave religion, but not the search for truth? Let's look at what's happening in real time. The numbers make it hard to ignore. In the United States, the share of adults who identify as religiously unaffiliated has risen from 16% in 2007 to over 28% today, according to Pew Research. In Western Europe, the pattern is sharper still. In the UK, for the first time in recorded history, the majority of the population now identifies as non-religious. Across the developed world, the institutional church is emptying. But here's what the headline rarely captures. The people leaving are not, for the most part, becoming atheists. Survey after survey shows the same thing. The majority still believe in something, in a higher power, in consciousness, in some form of meaning that transcends the material. They haven't stopped searching. They've stopped searching inside the institution. In fact, the fastest growing religious category in the Western world is not atheism. It's spiritual, but not religious. So what does this mean? What does the institution no longer provide that they're trying to find somewhere else? To answer that, first we need to understand the difference between religion and spirituality. Religion is often based on institution. Spirituality is often based on experience. Let me put it simply. Picture a traveler who receives a detailed map of a mountain. The map seems accurate, drawn by people who climbed it, refined over centuries, trusted by thousands. Every trail is marked, every danger noted, every summit labeled. But here's the problem. You can memorize every symbol on that map. You can study it, defend it, teach it to your children, and still never once set foot on the mountain. Religion provides the map, a shared set of truths, passed down through generations, preserved in scripture, ritual, and community. Spirituality is the journey, the individual's attempt to experience those truths directly, with their own feet on the actual terrain. This distinction explains almost everything about why people are leaving. They're not rejecting the mountain. They're asking whether the map is the same thing as the climb. Religion asks you to believe. Spirituality asks you to explore. And throughout history, some traditions have argued that the journey isn't just preferable to the map. It's the only thing that actually works. So let's look at what the map is actually made of. Religion and spirituality are often treated as the same thing. They are not. Historically, they are built on two completely different foundations. One preserves truth. The other tries to discover it. And why does this matter? First, we need to ask why religion exists at all. Not in the cynical sense, not as an answer to fear of death or a tool of social control, but functionally. What problem did it solve? The answer is one of the most practical in human history. A civilization cannot rediscover its deepest truths from scratch every generation. The insights of the mystic, the philosopher, the prophet, the moments of genuine contact with something beyond ordinary experience, cannot be reliably transmitted through oral tradition alone. Most people, most of the time, will not have those experiences, and even those who do need a framework to make sense of what they encountered. Religion solves this problem. It stores the insight. It builds a container around the flame so the wind doesn't extinguish it. That container has several components that have appeared, in some form, in virtually every religious tradition on earth. The first is doctrine, a codified set of beliefs about the nature of reality, the divine, the human condition, and what is required of us. Doctrine answers the fundamental questions in advance, so that members of the community don't have to derive the answers individually. The Nicene Creed, the 5 Pillars, the 4 Noble Truths as institutional teaching. Each of these is a distillation, an attempt to capture in transmissible form something that was originally experienced directly. The second component is scripture, the written record of revelation, prophecy, or wisdom, fixed in text so it can be passed across time without corruption. The Bible, the Quran, the Vedas, the Pali Canon. These are archives. They preserve the maps drawn by those who climbed the mountain in enough detail that future generations can orient themselves without having to start from zero. The third is ritual, the embodied practice that makes doctrine tangible, that moves belief from the abstract into the body, the calendar, the community, the Sunday Mass, the daily Sala, the Sabbath meal. Ritual is the means through which the map becomes something you can actually hold in your hands. And then there's authority, the priest, the imam, the rabbi, the monk, the designated interpreter who stands between the text and the individual, ensuring the map is read correctly and the tradition maintained. Authority creates continuity. It also, as the previous video showed, creates the conditions for the shadow. Together, these four components, doctrine, scripture, ritual, authority, produce something extraordinarily powerful. A shared reality. A community of people who inhabit the same map of existence, who understand life, death, suffering, and meaning in the same terms. The psychological power of that shared reality is not nothing. It is, in many ways, the most durable social structure ever invented. Emile Durkheim, in The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, argued that religion's primary function was never really theological, it was social, the creation and maintenance of collective identity through shared sacred symbols. The map, in other words, is not only a description of the mountain, it is the thing that makes a group of individuals into a community. This is the deep logic of religion, and it works. For most of human history, for most human beings, the map was enough. It provided orientation, community, moral structure, and a framework for confronting suffering and death. But the map has a structural limitation that has always existed, even when it wasn't spoken about openly. A map is a representation of terrain. It is not the terrain itself. The mystic traditions within every major religion have always known this, and have always been slightly uncomfortable with the institution as a result. The Christian contemplatives, the Sufi orders within Islam, the Kabbalists within Judaism, the Zen masters within Buddhism. These were people who had, in some sense, been on the mountain, and they returned with a consistent report. The map is useful, but there is something the map cannot convey. Direct experience cannot be fully transmitted through doctrine. It can be pointed at, hinted at, prepared for, but the map will always be at one remove from what it describes. Religion tries to preserve truth. Spirituality tries to verify truth. That is the distinction the map metaphor illuminates. The institution's purpose is conservation, keeping the flame alive across time, across generations, across the disruptions of history. The spiritual impulse's purpose is something different, to stop reading about the fire and find out what it actually feels like to touch it. For most of religious history, these two impulses coexisted within the same institution. The mystic and the theologian lived in the same monastery. The contemplative and the priest served the same church. What's new about the present moment is not the impulse to go beyond the map. That impulse is ancient. What's new is that millions of people are pursuing it outside the institution entirely, which raises a question the map metaphor can't quite answer on its own. If someone stops trusting the map, but still needs to find the mountain, where do they go? At its core, religion usually begins with a simple instruction: believe. Believe in the doctrine, believe in the scripture, trust the map. It was drawn by people wiser than you, refined over centuries, and billions have used it to navigate their lives. You don't need to verify it. You need to follow it. But spiritual traditions begin somewhere else entirely. Religion is often based on faith. Spirituality is often based on discovery. Let that sit for a moment, because the difference is more radical than it first appears. Faith, at its best, is not naive. It's not blind. It's a form of trust, a willingness to orient your life around truths you haven't personally verified, on the authority of those who came before you. And there's some logic to that. Think about how you move through the world every single day. You didn't run your own clinical trials before taking medicine your doctor prescribed. You didn't personally verify the laws of aerodynamics before boarding a plane. You trusted accumulated knowledge, systems that had proven themselves over time. Faith in a religious tradition works the same way. You trust the map because millions of people before you used it to navigate the unsurvivable, grief, death, the question of why any of this exists at all. That's not nothing. But here's where it gets interesting. Discovery operates on a completely different premise. Faith is trusting the map, a truth that has been handed down. Discovery is exploring the terrain, verifying that truth for yourself. The person of discovery doesn't begin by accepting. They begin by asking. They treat the inherited map not as a destination, but as a starting hypothesis, something worth testing with their own feet on actual ground. They are less interested in what the tradition says about the mountain than in what the mountain actually feels like when you're standing on it. Now, this is not necessarily a rejection of the tradition. It can be, and often is, a deepening of it. Imagine someone who grew up attending church every Sunday. They know the hymns. They know the prayers. They believe, genuinely, in what they were taught. And then one day, maybe through a moment of real suffering or a question the priest couldn't quite answer, they stop accepting and start actually looking, not to disprove anything, just to see. What they find might confirm everything they were given, or it might transform it into something they couldn't have reached by faith alone. Either way, the map and the mountain turn out to be different things. So what does this mean for the millions leaving religion today? They are not, for the most part, abandoning the question, and they are not abandoning the divine. They're abandoning the institution that told them the divine was only accessible through approved channels, through the right doctrine, the right scripture, the right authority standing between them and whatever is actually there. What they're searching for, whether they call it God, the universe, the source, or simply something larger than themselves, is a direct personal relationship with the divine. No intermediary, no filter, no map required. And how are they looking for it? Through meditation, stillness and time alone in nature, through breathwork, contemplative prayer, fasting, through moments of genuine silence in a world that doesn't shut up. Different methods, same intention, to reconnect with something they feel they've lost access to, or perhaps were never given access to in the first place. And here's where it gets interesting, because the institution, in many cases, taught people something about themselves that may have been the very thing creating the distance, that you are flawed, sinful, fallen, fundamentally separated from the divine, and dependent on the institution to bridge that gap for you. But what if that's not the whole story? Jesus himself said, "You are gods." Sit with that for a second. Not, "You are sinners hoping for God's mercy." Not, "You are small and God is distant." You are gods. He also said, "You will do even greater things than I have done." Now, if we are only human, flawed, broken, permanently separated from the divine, how do we do greater things than Jesus? His message, underneath the centuries of institutional interpretation, was one of radical empowerment, of enlightenment, of showing the way back to what he called the Father, not as a distant authority to be obeyed, as a source to be reconnected with. He also said, "When you pray, go into your room and shut the door." Why the closed door? Because the connection isn't out there. It isn't in the cathedral, in the crowd, in the performance of public faith. It's in the quiet, in the stillness, in the moment when the external noise drops away and something else becomes audible. Think of it like this. Imagine you're trying to listen to a radio, but all you're getting is static. You can feel that there's something being transmitted. You can almost make it out, but the noise is too loud, too overwhelming, so you start adjusting the frequency, slowly, carefully, turning the dial until the static begins to thin, until fragments of something come through. A melody, a voice, something real underneath all that interference. And then, if you're patient enough, if you fine-tune it precisely enough, the noise disappears and the music plays. What just happened? You opened a channel, between you and what was always being transmitted. You didn't create the signal. You cleared the interference so you could finally receive it. That, in a single image, is what spirituality is. A direct channel to the divine, and the only thing standing between you and it is the noise. The noise of the world, the noise of distraction, obligation, and endless scroll. The noise inside your own head, the self-criticism, the anxiety, the running commentary that never stops. The noise of being told for years that you are not worthy of direct contact. So the question becomes, how do you silence it? That question is ancient. It didn't begin with declining church attendance or modern disillusionment. It began, at the very latest, 2,500 years ago, in the forests of northern India, with a man who walked away from everything he was supposed to believe because he decided he needed to find out for himself. In fact, two ancient traditions went even further than simply preferring discovery over faith. They argued that blind faith could actually prevent you from finding the truth, that the map, held too tightly, could become the very thing keeping you from the mountain. One of those traditions we've already met. Its institutional shadow appeared in our last video. But its founding philosophy, before the institution, was something almost startlingly different, something closer to a scientific experiment than a religion. And that's where Buddhism enters this story. Because what the Buddha taught, 25 centuries before the modern exodus from religious institutions, was essentially what millions of people today are acting on instinctively. That the divine does not require an institution to reach it, that the sacred is not administered from above, it is discovered from within. Now, we need to look at this carefully, because what the Buddha actually taught, before it became an institution, was something deeply unusual for a religious founder. He didn't ask people to believe him, he asked them to test him. But first, a clarification. Faith, in the Buddhist tradition, is not the enemy. It's called saddha, and it functions as a starting point, a provisional trust, the willingness to follow a path far enough to see whether it leads anywhere worth going. Think of it like this. You hear that there's a view from the top of a mountain that will change how you see everything. You haven't seen it. You can't know if it's true, but something in you responds to the description. You decide to start climbing. That responsive trust, the willingness to begin before you've verified, is saddha. But here's what makes Buddhism different. Saddha is designed to make itself obsolete, because the goal was never belief, the goal was awakening. The Buddha embedded this principle in a single word, ehipassiko. It means, come and see for yourself, not trust me, not believe this because it is written. Come and see for yourself. The teachings were presented not as sacred truths to be accepted on authority, but as hypotheses to be personally investigated. The metaphor the early texts use is precise. Test the teachings the way a goldsmith tests metal, by heating it, hammering it, examining it under pressure, not by trusting the goldsmith's word that it's pure. Test it yourself. This turns the entire religious relationship inside out. Instead of the teacher holding the truth and transmitting it through authority, the teacher simply points and says, "Go look. Don't believe me. Go look." Now here's a story moment that stopped people in their tracks 2,500 years ago, and it still does. Picture a village in ancient northern India, a group of ordinary people, farmers, merchants, families, who have been visited by teacher after teacher, each one contradicting the last, each one confident, each one claiming to have the truth. The villagers are exhausted and genuinely confused. And then the Buddha arrives. They go to him and ask, openly, "Teacher, how are we supposed to know who's telling the truth?" Now think about what you'd expect a religious teacher to say. "Trust this scripture. My teaching is the correct one." The Buddha said none of that. He looked at them and said, in effect, don't believe something simply because it is written in scripture. Don't believe it because it is tradition. Don't believe it because a teacher says it, because many people believe it, or because it has been passed down through generations. Instead, evaluate whether a teaching leads, in your own direct experience, to clarity, compassion, and freedom from suffering. If it does, adopt it. If it doesn't, set it aside. The villagers stared at him in silence. He had just told them not to believe him either, unless they could verify it themselves. That is the Kalama Sutta. And in one short conversation, the Buddha replaced authority with investigation. The measure of a teaching is not its source. It is its effect, in your own mind, your own life, your own direct experience. So what happens to sadhana, that initial faith, as practice deepens? It gets replaced, not by doubt, by something more durable. Prajna, direct wisdom, the knowledge that comes not from being told, but from seeing. The difference between knowing intellectually that fire is hot and having burned your hand. As you practice, as you actually sit, observe, investigate your own mind, something shifts. The things the tradition describes stop being doctrinal claims. They start being directly visible. Take impermanence, the simple but profound recognition that nothing lasts, that every thought, emotion, sensation, and experience is temporary and constantly changing. You stop accepting that as a concept and start seeing it, moment by moment, in the rise and fall of every thought, every sensation, every mood. At that point, faith is no longer needed. The scaffolding comes down because the building can stand on its own. And what is the building? In Zen Buddhism, the destination gets a specific name: Satori, sudden realization. A moment in which you don't learn something new. You perceive something that was always there, from which you had simply been obscured. Imagine waking up in a room you've lived in your whole life, suddenly, for the first time, actually seeing it. Not because anything in the room changed, because something in you finally became still enough to actually look. That's the closest analogy. Satori is not an intellectual event. You cannot think your way into it. It is a perceptual shift, a change not in what your mind contains, but in how it sees. The self that seemed so solid and permanent suddenly appears differently. Reality that seemed fixed opens up into something more fluid, more immediate, more strange and alive than the map ever suggested. Enlightenment is not accepting a doctrine. It is seeing reality differently. And this means the entire structure of Buddhist practice, the ethics, the meditation, the community, the teachings, is not the destination. It is the preparation. The map exists to get you to the mountain. Once you're there, you can set it down. But Buddhism was not the only tradition that understood this. Another ancient movement, arising in a completely different world, built its entire cosmology around the same fundamental claim. They used a different language, they described a different universe, but they were pointing at the same door. Let's start with the word that defined this movement, gnosis, from the Greek. What does it mean? Not knowledge in the abstract academic sense, not the kind of knowledge that lets you pass a test. Direct experiential knowing, the difference between knowing that the ocean is cold and stepping into it for the first time in January. In ancient Greek thought, two words carved out completely different territories. Pistis, faith, belief, accepting something on trust or authority. And gnosis, direct knowledge, the kind that arrives not through instruction, but through encounter. For the Gnostic movements that spread across the Mediterranean world in the first centuries of the Common Era, this was not an academic distinction. It was the difference between slavery and liberation. For many Gnostic groups, faith was considered inferior to knowledge. Not wrong exactly, but incomplete. A placeholder, like holding a photograph of someone you've never met instead of actually knowing them. And this idea created one of the most radical and most dangerous spiritual movements in history. Now here's where the Gnostic worldview gets genuinely strange and genuinely fascinating, because the Gnostics made a claim that almost no one in the ancient world was making. The world was not created by the highest God. Let that land for a second. According to many Gnostic sects, the material universe, the physical world of matter, bodies, suffering, and limitation, was the creation of a lesser being. A flawed divine craftsman they called the demiurge. From the Greek word for craftsman, the demiurge wasn't simply evil. That would be too simple. It was something more unsettling, ignorant. It believed itself to be the highest God. It didn't know that above it, Beyond the material cosmos it had made, existed a deeper, truer, more complete reality, the pleroma, the fullness. The pleroma is not simply heaven in the conventional sense. In Gnostic cosmology, it is the realm of the original source, the ultimate divine reality from which all genuine existence flows, pure, undivided, complete. The ground of all being, before any creation, before any separation, before the demiurge's flawed world was ever made. In Gnostic understanding, that's where we actually come from. Not this body, not this personality, but the deepest thing we are, the part that arrived here from somewhere else and has never fully forgotten it. Now here's why this is important to understand. If the material world is the creation of a limited, self-deceived being, then the institutions claiming to speak for the creator of this world are, however sincerely, working with an incomplete map. They are preserving a map drawn by someone who had never seen the whole mountain. In other words, the problem was not simply ignorance. The problem was that the world itself, the one we inhabit, is an illusion, a trap that keeps us separate and unaware of the divine source. But here's what makes the Gnostic view extraordinary. They didn't stop at the trap. They said, you have something inside you that the trap cannot touch. According to Gnostic teaching, every human being contains a fragment of the genuine divine reality, the reality that predates and transcends the demiurge's creation entirely. Not metaphorically, not as a comforting idea. Actually, they called it the divine spark. And the consequence of this is everything. If the deepest thing you are is divine, then salvation is not a transaction between a guilty creature and a judging God. It is not about obeying the right laws, or holding the right beliefs, or belonging to the right institution. It is about remembering who you actually are. In Gnostic language, salvation was not forgiveness from sin. It was awakening to your true nature. And here's why this matters for the conversation we're having. This is precisely what millions of people today are realizing when they say they are spiritual but not religious. They are not rejecting the divine. They are rejecting the idea that the divine is somewhere outside themselves, stored in an institution, administered by an authority, accessible only through the approved procedure. The Gnostics were saying it 2,000 years ago. The divine is not something you learn about or some place you go to. It is something you uncover, inside yourself, in the deepest layer of what you already are. So how did the Gnostics view institutional mediation? The Gospel of Thomas, one of the texts discovered buried in the Egyptian desert in 1945, hidden there to protect it from destruction, gives us a direct look. Unlike the canonical Gospels, it contains no miracles, no resurrection narrative, no theology of atonement. It is simply a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus, and almost every single one points inward rather than outward. One of the most discussed is, "The kingdom of God is inside of you, and it is outside of you." Pause on that. Not in the temple, not in the approved text, not administered by the priest standing between you and God, inside you, and woven through the fabric of reality itself. This is the Gnostic critique of institutional religion in a single line. Divine truth is not controlled by institutions. It is discovered within consciousness itself, by anyone willing to do the inner work of actually looking. Now here's what's fascinating. Elaine Pagels, in the Gnostic Gospels, makes an observation that lands hard when you sit with it. What disturbed the emerging Orthodox Church about the Gnostics was not primarily their strange cosmology. It was the authority structure that cosmology implied. Think about it. If the divine is directly accessible within each person, if no institution, no priest, no book stands between you and ultimate reality, then the entire architecture of religious authority becomes, at minimum, optional. The Gnostics didn't simply disagree with the Church on theological points. They rendered it structurally unnecessary, and that, more than anything, is why their texts were burned. Now, I want to tell you a story. It's an ancient one, preserved in a Gnostic text called the Acts of Thomas, and it might be one of the most quietly devastating descriptions of the human condition ever written. It's about a prince that lived in a great kingdom in the East. His parents, the king and queen, had a mission for him. He was to travel to a distant land called Egypt and retrieve a great pearl, guarded there by a serpent. He set off with purpose, carrying the memory of who he was, where he came from, and why he had come to this land. But when he arrived in Egypt, something happened. He ate the food of the land. He began to dress as the locals dressed, speak as they spoke. He started living as they lived, day by day, in the rhythms of ordinary life, and slowly, without noticing it happening, he forgot. Not all at once, gradually, the way any world, if you live in it long enough, starts to feel like the only world. The mission faded, the memory of the palace dimmed. The prince fell into a kind of deep sleep, not unconscious, but no longer awake to what he really was. Then, from far away, a letter arrived, from his parents, speaking to something in him that the forgetting had buried but never destroyed. He read it, and he woke. He remembered the pearl, the mission, the kingdom waiting. So he retrieved what he came for and returned home. Here's what the story means. Egypt is the material world, the ordinary life that absorbs us so completely we forget we ever had another one. The pearl is the soul, the divine spark, the deepest thing you are. The letter is the moment of Gnostic awakening, the transmission of the knowledge of your true nature, and the return home is reunion with the pleroma, the divine fullness. The problem, the Gnostics said, is not sin. The problem is forgetting. And remembering requires not belief, but a genuine transformation of the inner life. Both the Buddha and the Gnostics arrived at the same conclusion from different directions. Spiritual insight does not happen automatically. It requires a change in how you see. How? Both traditions developed specific practices designed to produce exactly that change. So let's talk about what that actually looks like. Here's the practical question. If the divine is directly accessible, if it doesn't require an institution, a priest, or an approved doctrine, then how do you actually reach it? This is the question every person who walks away from religion eventually faces. They've left the institution. They still feel the pull towards something deeper, but without the map, without the ritual, without the community telling them what to do on Sunday morning, how do they find their way? How does a human being, born into a mind full of noise, habit, craving, and distraction, actually get to experience the divine? The Buddhist answer, across all its schools and centuries, comes down to one thing: train the mind. Not to fill it with new beliefs, to clean the lens. What do I mean by that? Let's try something together. Close your eyes for a moment, or soften your gaze if you're somewhere you can't. Take a slow breath in. Hold it for just a second. Now let it go, slowly. Notice what's still happening in your mind. The thoughts moving through, the sounds around you, the small pull of whatever you were thinking about before this video. Just notice. Don't change anything. Don't try to stop them. Just watch them move through, the way you'd watch clouds crossing the sky from a window. That simple act, that noticing, is the beginning of what Buddhism calls samatha, calm abiding, training sustained attention on a single object, usually the breath, returning to it again and again when the mind wanders. And it will wander, constantly at first. That's not failure. That's the practice. Each time you notice you've drifted and gently come back, that is the repetition that slowly, over time, changes something. What does it change? It demonstrates, not as a concept, but as a direct personal discovery, that attention can be directed, that the constant stream of mental noise can be slowed, and that beneath the noise, there is something quieter, something that was always there, waiting, the music playing in the radio. Once attention is stabilized, something more interesting becomes possible. The second practice, vipassana, insight meditation. Now you're not just calming the mind, you're turning it toward itself. Imagine sitting quietly, breath steady, and beginning to observe your own thoughts, not to analyze them, not to judge them, but simply to watch them arise, take shape, and pass. You notice that anxious thought appeared. It peaked. It faded. You notice That memory surfaced. It felt real and immediate. It dissolved. You notice, that mood came over you like weather, and like weather, it moved on. Here's what starts to emerge from this, over sustained practice. Thoughts are not commands. Emotions are weather, not climate. And the feeling of a fixed, solid you at the center of all this experience, the one who seems to be running the show, is not quite what it presents itself as. Now the Zen tradition takes this further, in a characteristically Zen way. It hands you an impossible question. What is the sound of one hand clapping? This is called a koan, a paradox. And it's not meant to be answered. It's meant to exhaust your analytical mind completely. You turn it over, try every angle, every logical approach, and every single one hits a wall. That's the point. Because in the moment the analytical mind finally gives up, when it stops trying to solve what cannot be solved, something else can become apparent in the silence that follows. A quality of awareness that is prior to thought, that watches every thought and feeling pass without being swept away by them. You've tuned into the radio station. Zen calls this the Satori moment, the sudden clearing. But whether it arrives suddenly or gradually, what practitioners across centuries and cultures consistently describe is the same. An awareness that was present before the first thought arose this morning, that will be present after the last thought passes tonight. And that is, in some fundamental way, not disturbed by any of the thoughts in between. The laboratory of the mind, when worked with consistently, produces a result that no amount of reading about it can substitute for. You stop believing that everything changes. You start watching it change, thought by thought, breath by breath. You stop believing in the constructed nature of the self. You start watching it construct itself, moment by moment, thought by thought. And something shifts. The noise that used to feel like the whole world reveals itself as just noise. And beneath it, steady, quiet, unchanging, the signal was always there. What about the Gnostics? How did they deal with this question? The Gnostics faced the same practical problem, expressed in their own language. If the divine spark is real, if the deepest thing you are is genuinely of divine origin, then why can't you simply see it? Why does the forgetting happen at all? And how does the remembering occur? Their answer was the same as Buddhism's, but framed differently. The path to the divine is not outward. It is not found in the right institution, the right doctrine, or the right ritual performed correctly enough times. It is inward. It's the systematic dismantling of everything that stands between you and what you already, fundamentally, are. Their answer introduced a concept that surfaces in virtually every deep contemplative tradition. The ego, the constructed self, is not something to be destroyed. It is the raw material of transformation. And the process they described is not subtraction. It's alchemy. The Gnostic path was structured around initiation, a staged movement through layers of identity, progressively revealing what lay beneath each one. The outer practices begin here. Imagine you've just sat down for contemplative prayer, not the kind that petitions God for something, but the kind that simply waits, receptive, open. Not trying to produce an experience, just making space for what's already present. Much like tuning into the radio station, not forcing the signal, but clearing enough silence to finally receive it. You breathe slowly. You let the noise of the day settle, the way sediment settles in water when it's no longer being stirred. And you hold quietly a single sacred name or phrase, a mantra, not as an intellectual concept, but as an anchor. Something to return to each time the mind tries to pull you back into its usual current. You are not trying to think your way to God. You are trying to get quiet enough to remember. That quieting is preparation for something deeper. The Gnostic initiatory path described 3 stages that appear across different schools and centuries with remarkable consistency. First, the death of the ego. Not a dramatic event, more like a slow loosening. The progressive dissolution of identification with the constructed self. The persona, the mask, all the roles accumulated over a lifetime. The dutiful child, the competent professional, the person defined by what they fear and what they desire. You begin to see these not as you, but as patterns, habits, costumes worn for so long they started to feel like skin. Second, the birth of the soul. As the outer mask loosens, something deeper begins to surface, a quality of presence that isn't anxious, isn't performing, isn't trying to protect itself. The psyche, in its fuller sense, no longer contracted around its wounds, but opening toward its own depth. This is the stage most people experience as the most disorienting and the most alive, because you're no longer sure who you are exactly. But whatever is emerging feels more real than what it's replacing. Third, what some Gnostic texts describe as the soul's movement beyond itself entirely, towards something that exceeds the personal, the point where individual spiritual experience opens into something larger. Now you can finally hear the music playing. The trajectory of the Gnostic path was called spiritual ascent, not a physical journey, but a perceptual one. Each stage of practice dissolves another layer of the material world's grip on awareness, until what remains is closer to the original state. The spark, aware of its own nature. The prince, awake, holding the pearl. At the deepest level of both traditions, the Buddhist and the Gnostic, something remarkable happens. After all the practice, all the stripping away, all the investigation, both paths arrive at the same discovery. Not a new belief, not a more sophisticated doctrine, a quality of awareness that neither thought nor emotion nor identity can fully account for, something that was present before the practice began and simply became visible through it. And there's a concept that describes this with striking precision, one that didn't come from a monastery or a Gnostic text, but from modern psychology, philosophy, and neuroscience. They all arrived at it independently, and they all gave it a different name for the same thing. Let's do another experiment. Right now. Notice your next thought. Don't try to control it or change it. Don't manufacture one. Just wait for one to appear, the way you'd wait for the next car to pass on a quiet street. Did it pop up? Now ask yourself something. Who noticed that thought? Something in you observed it, registered it, watched it arise, take shape, and begin to pass. If you can observe a thought, you cannot be that thought. This is a small experiment, almost embarrassingly simple, but what it points at has been documented independently across spiritual traditions, philosophy, and modern science. Psychology calls it metacognition, the capacity to observe your own mental processes, to think about thinking, to watch the mind from a slight remove rather than being entirely swept up inside it. Cognitive scientists have studied it extensively. It is measurable, trainable, and directly linked to emotional regulation and psychological well-being. Philosophy calls it the transcendental subject, Kant's term for the observing self that is always present as the background of experience. Descartes pointed at it when he said, "I think, therefore I am." The very act of doubting requires a doubter, an observer who notices the doubt arising. Neuroscience has found it in the brain. Studies of experienced meditators show measurable changes in the default mode network, the region responsible for self-referential thought, the inner narrator that tells you the story of who you are. In deep meditative states, this region quiets, and what remains, practitioners and researchers consistently describe in the same terms, a clear, stable awareness that was always present beneath the noise. Buddhism calls this the witness, the silent observer. The Gnostics called it the pneuma, the divine spark. What it's called matters less than what it is. A layer of awareness that predates your thoughts, outlasts your moods, and belongs to none of the stories your mind tells about you. And here's what both traditions understood about it. You don't create it, you uncover it. And what you uncover, when you do, is the point of contact between you and the divine. Not the divine as something external, somewhere above you, requiring an institution to mediate the relationship, but the divine as the deepest layer of what you actually are, the place where the personal and the transcendent meet. This is what spirituality, real spirituality, as opposed to the word on a wellness app, has always pointed at. not a feeling, not a philosophy, a direct encounter. Both traditions use the same image to describe how you get there, in different forms, across different centuries. The mirror. Imagine a mirror completely covered with dust. Objects placed in front of it appear distorted, muted, barely recognizable. The problem is not the mirror. The mirror is perfect. The problem is the dust, the accumulation of conditioning, habit, reactivity, the endless self-referential commentary of the busy mind that prevents it from doing what it is perfectly capable of doing. Practice, whether Buddhist or Gnostic, does not create the mirror. It cleans it. Now, what does it actually feel like when it begins to clear? Imagine you've been sitting quietly for 20 minutes, breath steady. The mental noise has, for the first time today, slowed down enough to notice the spaces between the thoughts. And in one of those spaces, something lands. Not a vision, not a dramatic experience, just a quiet recognition. You are not your thoughts. You have been watching them this whole time, and the watcher has been completely undisturbed by every single one of them. That is the first glimpse of what the Buddhist tradition calls equanimity. Not indifference, not detachment in the cold, disconnected sense. Something more like the stability of deep water. The surface may be disturbed by weather, but the depth is unaffected. Events still register, emotions still arise, but they arise in a space that is larger than they are, and they no longer have the complete power to define you. What does this mean in practice? Let's make it concrete. Think about the last time you received criticism, at work, from someone you love, in a comment somewhere online. That immediate internal contraction, the heat in the chest, the mental machinery that fired up instantly, building the defense, rehearsing the response, replaying the moment on loop. All of that is the identified self doing what it does, defending the story of who it is. Now imagine, not suppressing any of that, but being able to observe it happening, watching the contraction, the heat, the loop, from a slight distance, still feeling it fully, but no longer being entirely swallowed by it. That gap, between stimulus and reaction, is what practice opens up. The Buddhists call it freedom from the second arrow. Here's how it works. The first arrow is what happens to you. The second is the story the mind adds on top, the resistance, the self-pity, the demand that things be otherwise. The silent observer does not fire the second arrow. It watches the first one land, registers it fully, and does not immediately reach for another. That is the silent observer, aware of the thought, but not governed by it. And there's a metaphor that captures this shift better than almost any other. Before practice, experience is like being a character in a film, fully absorbed in the plot, caught in every reversal, frightened by the threats, elated by the victories, unable to remember, for more than a moment, that you're watching a film at all. The character's survival is everything. The story is everything. After sustained practice, something changes. You begin to notice the screen. The film is still playing. The character still moves through the story. But there is a growing recognition of something prior to the film, the screen itself, the awareness in which the whole experience is appearing. And the screen, unlike the character, cannot be harmed by what appears on it. It doesn't change when the story changes. It was there before the opening frame and will be there after the credits roll. Now you move from being a character in the movie to being the screen on which the movie plays. This is not a description of becoming emotionless or unreachable. It is a description of becoming less afraid. Because the thing that was most afraid, the constructed self that needed the story to go a certain way, has been recognized as a temporary appearance rather than the final truth of what you are. So coming back to the mirror, when it clears, something deeper becomes visible. Reality looks different from this vantage, not emptied of meaning, differently full, not distant from experience, more immediate than it has ever been. And both traditions insist that once glimpsed, this cannot be fully unseen. You can forget, the dust can return. But now you know that the mirror is there. What exactly does reality look like from here? Buddhism gave a precise answer. 3 specific observations about the nature of experience that the cleared mirror consistently reveals, and that the tradition holds to be universally true. The Buddhist tradition does not leave what the practice reveals to private interpretation. It names it, precisely, 3 marks of reality, observations about the nature of experience that sustained practice consistently surfaces, not as doctrines to accept, but as facts to directly encounter. Anicca, dukkha, anatta, impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, non-self. Let's start with anicca, impermanence. On the surface, the most obvious of the 3. Impermanence is the recognition that all things, material objects, emotions, relationships, even life itself, are in a constant state of flux and will eventually come to an end. Nothing is fixed. Nothing lasts. Everyone knows this. But there's a difference, a vast difference, between knowing something intellectually and actually seeing it. Let me show you what I mean. Imagine a child at the beach, building a sandcastle at the water's edge. She works with complete absorption, smoothing the walls, shaping the towers, placing a small shell carefully at the very top. For the duration of that building, the castle is her whole world. And then the tide shifts. The first wave reaches the base. Something in her wants to hold it, save it, stop what is already, clearly, in motion. The wave doesn't ask permission. Now here's what's interesting. The Buddhist insight is not that the castle shouldn't have been built, or that the absorption was foolish. The castle was worth building. The attention was genuine. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises not from change itself, but from our attachment to things as if they were permanent. The insight is about how you react to the wave. The suffering in that moment is proportional not to the loss, but to the resistance, to the gap between what is and what the attached mind insists should be. The castle was always a temporary arrangement of sand. The suffering is in the forgetting of that. When you start to see impermanence directly, not as a concept but as the actual texture of each moment, something shifts. You stop fighting the tide, not because you stop caring, but because you stop being shocked every time the wave comes. That's anicca. The second one is dukkha, usually translated as suffering, but more precisely, unsatisfactoriness. The quality of experience that keeps reaching but never fully landing. So what does this mean? Dukkha doesn't claim that life is only painful, or that pleasure is an illusion. It claims something more specific, that the very structure of craving, of reaching toward pleasant experience and away from unpleasant, is itself a source of persistent dissatisfaction, regardless of whether any particular wish gets fulfilled. Think about the last thing you really wanted. When you got it, how long did the satisfaction last? A week, a month, and then the wanting moved to the next thing, to more of the same thing, or shifted into anxiety about losing what you'd just gotten. That's not a personal failing. It's simply how the untrained mind works, always reaching for more, always bracing against loss, never quite arriving. When you start to see that pattern clearly, not as a philosophy but as something you can actually watch happening in real time, something loosens. Not the experiences themselves, the grip, the exhausting cycle of chasing and avoiding that never quite delivers what it promises. The third, and last, is anatta, non-self, the most radical of the 3, and the most difficult to summarize. Here's the core idea, that fixed, continuous you at the center of your experience. The one who seems to be watching all of this, making all the decisions, owning all the experiences, is not quite what it presents itself as. Buddhism's doctrine of non-self asserts that no permanent, unchanging essence exists within you or within any phenomenon. What we call the self is not a solid, independent thing. It is a constantly changing, interconnected process. In Buddhist teaching, what you experience as I is actually a combination of 5 shifting, impermanent components: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. None of them, alone or together, constitute a fixed soul. That's what vipassana practice begins to reveal, at sufficient depth. The sense of I is a process, not an entity. A rapid flow of changing thoughts, habits, and perceptions, rather than a static, enduring soul. The mind synthesizes them into the narrative of a stable self, the way film frames moving at speed create the illusion of continuous motion. The self is not found, it is generated, moment by moment, by the same process that generates every other mental event. Now, this does not mean you don't exist, or that your life doesn't matter, or that you should stop functioning as a person in the world. It means that the self, the one that needed the story to go a certain way, is not a fixed, independent entity. And when that's perceived directly, rather than accepted as a philosophical claim, something relaxes. Understanding anatta helps reduce craving, attachment, and suffering because it breaks down the rigid, defensive ego that was generating them in the first place. The three marks together dissolve the illusion of a permanent self, and what they reveal in its place is not emptiness in the bleak sense. It is freedom. Because what was obscuring freedom was not life itself, but the mind's resistance to life as it actually is. And here's the connection to everything this video has been building toward. This freedom, this spaciousness that opens when the resistance drops, is what many people who describe themselves as spiritual are actually pointing at. Not a belief system, not a new religion, a direct, unmediated experience of something that feels, to those who encounter it, like contact with the divine itself. Not the divine described in a book, not the divine administered through an institution, the divine encountered directly, in the quiet of your own awareness. Gnosticism described a parallel journey, but where Buddhism strips away the self and finds freedom in the spaciousness that remains, the Gnostic path strips away the self and finds something it insists was hidden there all along. In the Gnostic understanding of what you are not one thing, you are three: soma, the body, the physical vehicle, the outermost layer through which you move through the world, real, necessary, not without value, but not ultimately who you are. Then there's psyche, the soul, the personality, the self that accumulates over a lifetime, memories, relationships, desires, wounds, patterns of thought and feeling, the character in the film. This is what most people mean when they say, I, and it is the layer that suffers, hopes, grieves, and loves in the ordinary human sense. And finally, pneuma, the spirit, the divine spark, the innermost layer, which does not belong to this world and was never fully of it. The Gnostic spiritual path is the progressive recognition of these layers, and the progressive release of identification with the outer two, until what remains is the third. It begins with the body. The first step of genuine spiritual work, in virtually every contemplative tradition, is developing a different relationship with physical experience. Not rejecting the body, not punishing it, simply ceasing to be entirely at its mercy. Imagine sitting in mild physical discomfort, a slightly uncomfortable chair, a long meditation session, a moment of hunger or restlessness, and instead of immediately relieving it, just noticing it, not suppressing the sensation, watching it, you begin to observe. The discomfort is there. It rises and falls. It intensifies and eases. And you, whatever you is, are watching it from a slight distance. I have a body, but I am not the body. The second layer is deeper and more intimate. The psyche, the accumulated self, is everything you've been told you are. Everything you've concluded about yourself from experience. Every role learned in the theater of social life. The loving parent, the dutiful spouse, the dedicated employee, the person who is good at certain things and afraid of others. This layer feels more like you than the body does. To question it is to question something that has, for most of a lifetime, felt like solid ground. But here's what contemplative inquiry, turning awareness back on itself and genuinely asking what is present beneath the personality, begins to reveal. The psyche, examined closely, shows the same quality that the Buddhist investigation of the self reveals. It is not fixed, not continuous. It is a collection of habitual patterns, a narrative constructed over time, a mask that became so familiar you forgot you were wearing it. I have thoughts, emotions, memories, but I am not these thoughts, not these emotions, not these memories. So what does that leave? In the Gnostic framework, the pneuma, the witness, the divine spark, which was never the body's aches and limitations, never the personality's stories and defenses, but was always present beneath them, watching, open, unconditioned. The goal of the Gnostic path, return to the source, to the pleroma, the divine fullness, is not a physical journey. It's a perceptual one. The recognition, from within ordinary human experience, of the divine nature that was always here, temporarily obscured by the layers of the false self. Jesus said, "I am not of this world," while navigating through it in a material body, eating, sleeping, suffering, like anyone else. The Gnostic proposition is that this was not a statement unique to Jesus. It is the condition of every human being who has forgotten what they are. The kingdom within that he spoke of is not a destination. It is not salvation from death, waiting somewhere on the other side of a final judgment. It is a realization, available here, now, in this life, that you are not ultimately from this world, that the deepest thing you are belongs to the source, not the trap. That is how you escape the illusion. Not by dying, not by being rescued, by remembering. Now compare this to Buddhism's destination. Buddhism strips away everything until only spaciousness remains. Sunyata, emptiness. Freedom in the recognition that the self and all phenomena are empty of fixed, independent existence. Gnosticism strips away everything until only fullness remains, the pleroma, divine completeness. Emptiness and fullness. These seem like opposites, and they are, in language. But here's what's interesting. Practitioners from both traditions describe experiences that resist easy categorization as one or the other. States of awareness that are simultaneously spacious and somehow present, without thought, and yet not merely empty. Perhaps these two traditions are describing the same room from different windows. The room is the silent observer, the quality of pure awareness that is prior to the self's constructions and larger than its fears. In either case, what the path strips away is identical. The identity we defend every day. The mask worn so long it felt like skin. The character in the film who forgot about the screen. What is left, both traditions suggest, is not nothing. It is the most fundamental thing there is, and it was always there. This is what the spiritual search looks like from the inside. Not a rejection of the divine, but the most direct pursuit of it possible. Stripped of doctrine, stripped of institution, stripped of everything that stood between the seeker and the source. Just you, and whatever is actually there. That, at its core, is what spirituality means. And this brings us back to where this whole conversation started. Throughout history, religions gave humanity something extraordinarily powerful. A map, a shared set of answers about where we come from, why we suffer, and where we're going. For thousands of years, that map helped civilizations orient themselves in a mysterious universe, gave ordinary people a language for the unbearable moments, a community for the loneliness, a framework for what otherwise doesn't seem to make sense. For most of human history, for most human beings, the map was enough. But today, millions of people are leaving the churches, the temples, the mosques, not always because they reject the sacred, but because they want to encounter it directly. They've held the map long enough. Now they want to find out if the mountain is real. The Buddha invited people to come and see for themselves. The Gnostics spoke of a divine spark within, not a doctrine to be accepted, but a reality to be uncovered. Different languages, different cosmologies, different centuries, but pointing toward the same threshold. Truth is not only something you believe, it is something you experience. Earlier in this video, you tried a small experiment. You watched a thought appear, and for a moment, something in you noticed it. Something that wasn't the thought, that remained when the thought passed, that was simply and quietly present through all of it. That recognition is where many of the deepest spiritual traditions begin. Not with belief, with attention. Religion can describe the sacred. Spirituality asks you to encounter it, not in a temple, not in a book, but in the quiet space of your own awareness, which has been here all along, waiting beneath the noise. And something unexpected is beginning to happen as this search moves beyond the traditional institutions. A new landscape is forming, shaped not by scripture or priesthood, but by technology, by algorithm, by the strange new architectures of digital community. The search for the sacred hasn't disappeared. It has simply moved inward and into new forms none of the old maps anticipated. What those forms look like, and whether they lead anywhere worth going, is exactly where we're headed next. If you enjoy exploring questions like this, leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Because in the end, the search for truth may not be about finding new beliefs. It may be about discovering something that was already there. And that might be the real journey. Until next time, keep questioning.